So, this video is about how BLM, etc., are fantasy, pure fantasy, and how that makes them actually more dangerous. So we're going to start with a quote, and of course, it's a Michel Foucault quote. This is from Michel Foucault's Nietzsche Genealogy History. Humanity does not gradually progress from combat to combat until it arrives at universal reciprocity, where the rule of law finally replaces warfare. Humanity installs each of its violences in a system of rules and thus proceeds from domination to domination. The nature of these rules allows violence to be inflicted on violence and the resurgence of new forces that are sufficiently strong to dominate those in power. Rules are empty in themselves, violent and unfinalized. They are impersonal and can be bent to any purpose. The successes of history belong to those who are capable of seizing those rules, to replace those who had used them, to disguise themselves so as to pervert them, invert their meaning, and redirect them against those who had initially imposed them. Controlling this complex mechanism, they will make it function so as to overcome the rulers through their own rules. And now I think, because we're almost ready to talk about Foucault, I think that now we need to actually take a real, legitimate look at this video of some kids, because they are kids, playing in a park in Philadelphia. Antifa children playing through a protest.
Let's do 10. Can we do 10? 10? Yeah.
Okay, so that video, I think, demonstrates aptly and in a nutshell how so many of these kids are living out a fantasy. I mean, particularly that one dude. I mean, that dude who gets stabbed early on and he just falls over and lies dead for the rest of the fight. First of all, he gets to opt out of the whole fight and not get embarrassed any further. But he takes this fantasy all the way. He lays there dead the entire time. I remember when I was like 8, I was in a play gunfight, and I ran from one place of cover to another, but I got gunned down by finger guns halfway through, and I sprawled on the concrete pavement of our apartment building's parking lot and lay there, stone cold dead. So, what's the word, verisimilitudinous, was my dead play acting. So impressed were my playmates that they gave me a pretend funeral. And they put flowers in my hands. And it was so moving, and this is a true story, so moving, that one solitary little tear leaked out of my eye because that fantasy was so real, it was so true. What a beautiful funeral my friends had given me, and how impressed they were at my real seeming death. So, I mean, a sword fight with foam swords. Wonderful. They're playing a game, and they get to write the rules of the game, and it doesn't matter how ridiculous it is. So let's talk about rules, the rules of the game. Power, for Foucault, is a game, and it's a set of rules. And rules are completely arbitrary. Christians have a lodestone for their rules, for their laws, for the way things ought to be structured. And although there can be a lot of variation in what that looks like, there's always that lodestone, which is revelation, revelation from God. Postmodernists eschew, they just eschew a lodestone, right? Everybody looks for a lodestone, something to hang on, something fixed, something eternal that they can hang their rules on. But, so brave, Nietzsche style brave, postmodernists don't do that. To them, rules are a means of obtaining and maintaining power. Rules are violence. And those who manage to overthrow the previous rules do so by redefining the rules, often, and he talks about this elsewhere, by playing the victim with the set of rules that exist, but mostly redefining the rules, saying setting different rules and winning that particular game, getting enough people to turn from one fantasy, which is all that rules are, a fantasy to power, and adopting a new one. BLM and their ilk are living a fantasy. And that's the danger, that enough people will buy into that fantasy, or at least buy into the possibility that there are other sets of rules that could be used. Now, I would not be the one to say that the rules that our society operate under are God's rules. The church is seeking after the way God wants us to make things. But certainly, we know that there is a way things ought to be. In the postmodern fantasy, in the fantasy of these children playing with foam swords in Philadelphia, there is nothing to strive for, which means this is a pure power grab. They want to be the ones in power, quite naturally, but the power is a means to itself. What is justice? I don't know. Justice also must be a construct. This fantasy, however, is a revolutionary sort of fantasy, a fantasy that could establish itself in reality, that they will be living out their dream, and their dream will include closing your church doors, forcing you to not preach the gospel. So it's worth fighting that fantasy now. When we see these kids playing with foam swords and pretending to die in a park as they LARP their way to Antifa heaven, we need to realize that that's actually more dangerous than, say, your typical Maoist guerrilla. Because there is just this full-fledged belief that they can make their own reality. And if they can make their own reality, they can purge things from their reality that make them uncomfortable, that might give them nightmares. So here's what I'll close with. Proclaiming the gospel and telling the gospel as story and as the story of the people of God. That's all mythology. Mythology in the truest sense. The stories that give us meaning. These are the things that we need to do now to combat that fantasy. They are trying to tell a story. They may believe in their heart of hearts that another story may come along to supplant it one day. For now, they want their story to dominate. Naturally. We ought to want the same thing. We ought to stop shying away, and we ought to proclaim the gospel.